welcome to this panel session. My name is Jo Twist. I'm the Chief Exec of Ukie Interactive Entertainment, which is a trade body and network representing games and interactive entertainment companies in the UK. I'm very pleased to be asked to host this panel session on accessibility, where to next, assuming that title, I think, makes a lot of assumptions as if we've come a massively long way, which we may or may not have, and that we've got new horizons to explore. So I hope to get into those issues quite fully with my panel over the next 45 minutes or so. We'll do a sort of discussion, and I want to keep it quite informal and open. And then we'll open up to the floor if you have any questions for our panelists. Alongside being CEO of Ukie, I'm also VP of Special Effects, which is gamers charity, which is doing fantastic work in the UK and across the world, in fact. They're a small charity. If you don't know about them, please Google them, because they do incredible work modding hardware and software to enable people to access games and play games and just basically have fun, be social, and have some element of control in their lives, sometimes for the first time ever. And so they do some really, really important work. And I'm keen that we, as an industry, really showcase the innovative work that they do to people outside the industry and try and spread that work as far as possible. And I am also, quite recently, then a snap election was called, I was asked by Penny Mordaunt, who is Disabilities Minister, to be the sector champion for disabilities for games. Not quite sure what that means. So hopefully this panel and your thoughts will help me figure that out. I'm just going to just introduce the panelists, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves a little bit, what currently they're working on. But we have Mark Friend, who is Sony Interactive Entertainment and working a lot of accessibility and inclusive work there. Ian Hamilton, who's an accessibility specialist and consultant. Henry Hoffman from Fiddlesticks, a developer of Hue fame. And Bryce Johnson from Xbox. So a range of platforms and development expertise and specialisms. As we know, the games industry is incredibly powerful. It's not just economically powerful. We're a $100 billion business globally. We're faster growing than film and TV. 1 in 3 people play games regularly in the UK, half of which are female. We are also, and across all age groups, but we are also a really important sector in terms of what we do culturally and socially. And I truly believe, and all throughout the stuff that I've done before Ukie and at Ukie, I think the inclusiveness of games is important, not just for our economic success, but to change people's lives. And I'm very excited personally about some of the innovations that our industry is seeing and how we can make use of that to really change the narrative around disabilities in particular. I think disabilities, people with different abilities, are cast in society as the economic underclass, and that's quite a harsh term, but that is how people and the narrative within society, I believe, is told, and we need to change that, and we have a really important and powerful role to do that. So just some figures for you. So I gave you some figures about the games industry, which I'm sure you all know about. There's also 13.3 million registered disabled people in the UK. 7% of children are registered disabled, and 18% of working age adults are registered disabled, and 44% of pension age, whether you believe in pensions now or not, adults are also have some sort of disability. I find it fascinating that we also don't necessarily capture the full range of what that means, and it can be as an aging population, I think it's an even more important issue for us as a society to be successful. So I want to just now turn to my panelists and just ask you each in turn just to introduce yourselves and tell me exactly what accessibility means to you. We'll start with you, Mark.
Okay, Mark, user researcher at Sony, do a lot of accessibility there. To me, it's always been something that I've noticed in my previous roles where I've worked, and then the information I was picking up at university during my master's course. It's always been something that felt like it wasn't necessarily a focus for a lot of people or a lot of companies, and that's something that I've always been keen to try and rectify and make sure that as many people are aware of the issues and as many people are trying to do the right thing and make it as inclusive as possible, and that's kind of the hole I'm trying to fill with my work at Sony.
Ian.
I'm Ian. I'm an accessibility specialist now. I started off in design and UX, gradually moved across to accessibility, and that's what I do now. What kind of first got me interested was working on kids' games for the BBC, so like CBeebies and CBBC and that kind of stuff, which were aimed at being inclusive to really profoundly disabled young preschool kids, and seeing the impact that it had on those children and the lives of those children and their families completely transformed through gaming. Because up to that point, the idea of the pinnacle for me was getting people to experience something, whether that's aesthetic, emotional stuff, and actually seeing that actually as an industry you've got so much power to do so much good and change people's lives was quite inspiring. There wasn't really a turning back from them. So that was kind of the first thing. The other thing was just from seeing the impact it has on people's businesses, seeing so many developers who are putting so much work into polishing a little detail to make the game that little bit more enjoyable, and then on the other hand making the game unintentionally miserable for 8% of their male players who are colourblind, that kind of thing.
Hey, is that on? So my name is Henry Hoffman. I'm creative director at Fiddlesticks. I made a game recently called Hue, and I'm currently in a cabin in Sweden making a very weird game. Oh, not currently, yeah. I'm currently here. So for me, accessibility in games really is, as an independent developer and working in a very small team, you're kind of building the games, but then you're also going to the show floor and you're meeting the sort of people that play the games on a very personal level. So if you've been working for 3 months or whatever on your first prototype for this new game, and you take it and you show it, and then someone comes along really excited to play the game, and then they realize that because of a physical disability they're unable to play your game, and they go away from your game sadder than when they came to you, that has a really profound impact on you as a game developer. And it was kind of at that point really that I decided that I want to make games playable to as many people as possible.
Bryce.
I'm Bryce. I actually have the privilege of being able to work on inclusive design at Xbox full-time. And I'm also a lead on the Gaming for Everyone team, which is a team that we have that is meant to be intentional about inclusion. And for me, accessibility is really starts with that word intentional. Like, it's about being intentional about what we create so that we don't marginalize people by their ability. That's really the way that we approach it.
Ian, can you just tell me a little bit about some of the misperceptions or some of the sort of things that people kind of assume about inclusive design?
Yeah, there's this kind of a common set of things, things that I thought myself. I wasn't born caring about accessibility. So there's misconceptions that I had, and it's the same kind of things that I've come across when I was doing work internally and doing work externally, speaking with all kinds of different companies. It's that accessibility is going to be something that's really difficult, really time-consuming, that it's going to mean diluting your mechanic down to suit some tiny niche who probably don't even play games anyway. A lot of people have, if not all those misconceptions, some of them, some kind of combinations of that. But actually, every single one of those is demonstrably false. As long as you think about stuff really early in development, you can do a lot very easily, very cheaply, even sometimes free, just through a simple design decision. And it impacts huge numbers of people. I mean, Joe's speaking about some of the statistics involved, and about that doesn't capture the totality of it as well. It doesn't cover things like colour blindness, 8% of males, difficulty reading, 14% of adults, but you don't really hear about that because there's a huge stigma. People don't discuss it. And also outside of that as well, just that so much of accessibility is just stuff that makes games better for everyone. Like button remapping, classic example of a really crucial accessibility feature for a lot of people who can't physically reach some areas of a controller. Also really good for everybody else who just disagrees with the designer's interesting decisions in the control scheme.
I mean, Henry, so you sort of mentioned small studios there. Did you think about this at the get-go with Hue, or was it the reaction from the show floor and the people who were playing?
So I think Hue's a good example because it's a mechanic that relies entirely on the identification of color. So I think we took it to a show floor and it became very apparent that people were struggling. People that wouldn't even necessarily classify themselves as colorblind. All sorts of people were suffering from not being able to distinguish different colors from other colors. So very early on, we kind of got this feedback, and we were able to engage with online communities. There's a subreddit dedicated to people with color blindness. And I think I posted a video of the game, and I was like, hey guys, I think I've created your worst nightmare. Can you help me out? And there was a huge response back. There was a bunch of suggestions, including sort of overlaying colors with different patterns so that people can identify patterns as kind of a secondary mode of communication. And then symbols was something that was also suggested. So at the beginning, it was kind of getting that feedback from taking the game out there where everyday consumers are, and then taking that feedback and engaging in a more direct approach with online communities.
So it sort of leads to a more sort of innovative gameplay.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can have these sort of weird, innovative mechanics that you only see in indie games, but they don't need to be exclusionary. Like, they can be accessible to everyone.
Bryce and Mark, I want to ask you, specifically representing sort of platforms, what kind of things are you leading on at the moment in order to encourage more inclusive design?
Sure. We actually think about inclusive design and accessibility as complementary but separate sort of approaches. Inclusive design for us is kind of thinking about not being in a place where you need accommodations that are traditionally associated with accessibility. Now, you always need to kind of do both. It's always sort of a balance. We like to think about inclusive design as the idea of not designing for everyone, even though, but the idea of like creating something for you, right? So I think we like to think about universal design as this one size fits all, and inclusive design as one size fits one. And that's a little bit of a specific ideal, but it is something we aspire to. And that's just sort of how we've approached it. And we do that through basically, we go around all the studios and we sort of work with people, trying to get them out of the headspace that they're in that leads to things being built upon their own biases, and therefore they can be exclusionary to someone else.
I mean, that's pretty important, isn't it? Because, we hear a lot about diversity, and diversity is incredibly important in terms of just being able to encompass that different experience of the world and view of the world. I mean, Mark, just tell us a little bit about what kind of things that you've been working on and how important that is.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm sure everyone on the panel and everyone in the audience will probably agree, it's we want it to be as inclusive as possible. Certainly the stuff that we're doing, we're looking at it in terms of kind of almost the collaboration with the usability and user testing stuff that we're doing, and kind of working together within our team to kind of almost form like this hybrid thing. So yeah, we're kind of including a lot of stuff with the usability reports, and kind of there's obviously accessibility stuff that goes with usability, a lot of tutorialization, stuff to do with that. Kind of goes hand in hand. So when it works together, we can kind of get across the teams a lot easier. Like, as well as the usability of your game, there's also these accessibility concerns that we can kind of mention. And not only is that coming from just kind of an expert review, but often we have kind of people in with color blindness or dyslexia or hearing impairments or anything like that, and they can feed back to us as well about certain issues they've had whilst playing the game.
But is that a sort of standard practice? I mean, and how easy is that for kind of smaller studios to be able to do that?
It's something that we're in the process of kind of making standard practice at the moment. So it's been a long time coming to kind of get it to a point where we can do it with every single user test that we're doing. But certainly within the next year or so, we're hoping that it's going to be something that where, with the user tests, we can also do accessibility and kind of make it something that's kind of quick and easy to do for teams of all sizes, and also cost effective. Obviously, when we do a usability evaluation or something like that, it's a much cheaper, much quicker turnaround, or something, and we can kind of get the feedback to the teams very quickly. But when we kind of recruit for accessibility, or if we get to a stage where we're kind of formally recruiting for accessibility, then obviously it's a longer process and can be a bit more expensive. So it's going forward, it's about finding that balance between kind of looking at the guidelines that are out there, looking at the guidelines that we've come up with, and kind of getting users in to kind of give us that direct feedback on the issues, and feeding that back to the teams, and them kind of going forward with the feedback.
I mean, Ian, you've been very active in this space, and you had the Parallel Conference on accessibility at GDC, which there was some great pieces coming out of that, I thought. Where do people go for the guidelines, and what more needs to be done in terms of sort of just standardizing some of these practices or some of the technologies, what's happening at engine level, etc.?
That's a few questions. So first one, the easy one, guidelines, is just gameaccessibilityguidelines.com. So it's just a free resource. It's got loads of examples of best practices and barriers people can come up against, and solutions to them. But in general, even without guidelines, even if you just spend just a little bit of time at the start of a project, just thinking like, these are the barriers that are in my game that relate to vision, hearing, manipulated controller, and seeing. You will realise that you've got a lot of barriers in your game. Some of them are going to be necessary, required barriers that are just a part of the mechanic. That's what makes the game fun, which is totally fine. And it's just about identifying those other ones that are unnecessary and figuring out ways around them. And it's usually down to one or two things. It's either communicating information in more than one way, like a symbol as well as a colour, or a subtitle as well as some audio, or just offering people some flexibility. So stuff like remappable controls, choice of difficulty levels, that kind of stuff. So it can go a really, really long way just through those couple of simple principles. But yes, there's the resources out there, there's the information, and there was other questions as well.
So what's the next step in terms of just making sure? So for example, what more could engines do?
Yeah, engines, that would be a really lovely thing to see some progress on, because traditionally engines have been a barrier to accessibility, when really they could be a big enabler. So a classic example being the way that blind people generally interact with technology is through a piece of software called a screen reader, where it basically passes all of the text and all the interface elements on the screen and just speaks them out through synthesized speech. That's how blind people use smartphones and PCs and stuff. But engines don't output any text or any UI elements. They've all got them inside, but then they just output a big lump of pixels that screen readers can't see. So that's the kind of thing that's a barrier within engines, kind of unnecessary barrier. So there's that kind of stuff that engines could do. Also, doing some of the heavy lifting for developers as well. So having like a nice subtitling system within the engine, having a nice remapping system in the engine to stop having to reinvent the wheel all the time. Also just offering some tools as well. So for example, Unreal now has a color blindness simulator built in. If you're using Unreal, you may not have seen it because it's buried quite deeply within the menus, but it is there. That's the kind of thing that would be really useful as well, those kind of simulations.
Bryce, have you seen sort of advances, and are you encouraged by some of the advances or some of the sounds coming out from platform holders, but also engines?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying really hard to figure out ways to bridge that gap between engine, platform, and the sort of the user. And I mean, in games, it's actually a lot trickier than it is in traditional software, where you don't typically have as many barriers. But so that is something that I think we're working on, and that's one thing that we do at Xbox, is we're trying to figure out how to remake these kind of technologies. But I will say, like, there is something that's really unique about games. I mean, we all kind of know it. I often fight with like the team that does the screen reader for Windows, because I'm like, this isn't an email. Stop trying to make this game like an email. Really, like that kind of thing. And so it really does come down to us as an industry being really, again, intentional about like how we want to design these experiences and working with the communities to kind of make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, Henry, have you seen some recent kind of advances that have encouraged you? I mean, and what do you guys do to kind of, spread that knowledge about how you actually did this in Hue?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I noticed a lot with some of the accessibility features that we worked with is that we are recreating the wheel again and again and again. So remappable controls is, when you're doing cross-platform development, is a real point of contention, because it's a fairly complicated system that you need to do, and you're usually building on top of a system that an engine already has but doesn't offer that support for. And I know that platforms are working on this. So Unity have got like a new input system that they're working on, which allows for the much easier integration of remappable controls. But really, it's the engines that need to offer that sort of out the box if it's going to be widely adopted, and not be kind of a burden on the developer as well.
I'm interested in some of the new emerging kind of ways in which our games are changing, specifically around AR, VR. I mean, I have this, I remember as a journalist, I did a couple of pieces on people and their avatars. There was a photographer who went around the world just photographing people, players, and their avatars. And there were a good few examples of people with disabilities who were, living a really fulfilling life, but also enjoying living in a social virtual world, whatever game that might be, usually World of Warcraft. But, for me, I was a heavy Second Life user. I can admit that now after 10 years. I've got over it. little bit. I've been to therapy. And for me, what excites me about VR is being able to be in those social virtual worlds and fly and do all sorts of things. I mean, is that something that is going to be something that, well, what are the design considerations for a start, and what's the limits of the technologies for, I guess, people with disabilities, specifically VR first, and then we can go into AR, because there's some obvious things around AR. Mark?
Well, there's definitely certain issues to do with, you can't assume everyone using a VR headset is able to stand up for a start. So it's kind of, guideline for whenever we're doing any PSVR stuff is to kind of ensure that it can be a seated experience. It's also little things that you might not think of is if something requires you to reach a particularly high point. I'm a fairly vertically challenged person, and if something's way over my head in a VR game and requires me to kind of hit that target, reach that lever, whatever, I'm not going to be able to do that, and I can't assume that everyone is going to be able to do that. So it's either, it all really comes back to the points Ian raised at the beginning. It's a case of either you design explicitly around that and kind of avoid the issue altogether, or you offer the flexibility to people to change things within the game to allow them to do that.
Because,
go
on.
There's a really nice example of that height thing from ILM X Lab, who did the Star Wars VR experience. And they, similar kind of thing, they're taking it around shows. They took it to, I think it was Star Wars Celebration, something like that. And they're having people coming up in a wheelchair to play the game, and there's a section in it where you have to reach up and grab hold of a panel on the inner side of the Millennium Falcon and pull it down to fix it, and they couldn't reach it. So that spurred them on to think about accessibility, and exactly that, offering some kind of flexibility, but also designing within the right kind of range of heights. And that's where it got interesting, because they looked at the Americans with Disabilities Act, so the legislation over the USA, for built environments. And that includes guidelines for things like, for example, what height you should put a cash machine, so that someone who stood up and someone who's in a wheelchair can reach it. And they applied all those real-world built accessibility recommendations to the virtual world as well.
So how did they get over that issue? It was just at the right height?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So within the right range, yeah.
Right.
But other games take different approaches. They allow you to configure. I think it's a job simulator where it's got you can reach down the panel underneath and hit a button and adjust the height. But there's a few games I think that do that, allow you to, different approaches, like allowing you to scale the environment or actually change the height you are. So again, it's just the range of human bodies, let alone being in a wheelchair.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that they did the ADA guidelines, but if you really think about it, I mean, we're creating these worlds. We can make them fit everyone, right? I don't understand. So
they can be better than real life, right?
Right,
exactly.
Right, exactly. And I mean, we talk about standing and sitting, but you put on a VR headset and you want to chill out in bed at night, and then you lie down, and all of a sudden, the horizon's over there, and you're kind of doing that. And I think I know that Able Gamers talks about the potential of VR a lot to really sort of enable people who can't get out. To get out and experience the world, and there is so much potential.
But it's not just, I guess, just having fun as well. It's I'm very kind of exercised about how the workplaces, and I'm actually sometimes shocked, even when we were looking at new offices, how few of them were actually accessible. And I sort of slightly get concerned about when I look at the wonderful things that HoloLens can enable people to do in the workplace and the workplace of the future. How are we actually ensuring that that's going to enable more participation economically of people in the workplace, in these worlds?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I think that's something, you mentioned HoloLens, that is something we're very focused on. And our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more, which, all these conversations that we're having about economic impact, that simple mission statement gives me a lot of freedom to kind of just go this. I don't have to justify it. I'm this is what the boss says. Every person, So I think though the challenge is also what Ian said, which is a lot of these engines are great at understanding things in 3D space, and then all they do is pump out pixels. And we need to figure out better ways to leverage that information in ways that we can produce that sonically, orally, tactily, all kinds of different ways.
I think with design, with VR design as well, the rule book for just interaction design alone is being torn up and rewritten on a daily basis. The idea that we can create a VR experience that is immediately accessible and kind of understand all those requirements from the offset, is just not possible. I think, again, we just need to work with people who suffer from these disabilities, and through user testing, everything needs to just kind of be built up from the ground up, and then the rulebook will be written kind of as VR develops, I should imagine.
Yeah, I think that's the exciting thing about VR is that there are people who are doing that at this stage of the development of the media. But certainly when touchscreens came along, that didn't happen. When motion controls came along, that didn't happen. But now you've got this early stage of VR, a lot of developers who are thinking really seriously about this stuff and doing some really good things. So hopefully, as those rules get written, they'll be written in the right way.
I mean, that's the exciting thing, as you say, because it is the opportunity to reinvent it properly. Where do people go for specifically around sort of mixed reality development, VR, AR? Is there someone gathering those resources and having a go at making those standard practices?
There isn't anything by means of kind of standard. I think probably the closest would be for simulation sickness. There's some pretty robust guidelines around for simulation sickness. Outside of that, there was a bunch of us got together and pulled together what we could. It's not so much standards, it's more just kind of suggestions of these are the kind of areas to look into, because a lot of those solutions are still to be defined. Right. And a lot of the answers that people have now will be rewritten with better ideas as time goes on. But if you just search for, I can't remember what the name of the post was, but if you search for Ian Hamilton Gamma Sutra VR, then it should come up.
Yep, that one. But certainly it sounds like it's something that should be kind of gathered together in one place. What about augmented reality? What I really loved about the stories in between us getting contacted by the press saying that Pokemon Go was causing kids to walk off cliffs was also the really nice stories about parents with kids with Asperger's or autism who said, for the first time my son or daughter actually looked at someone in the face or wanted to break out of their routine because they wanted to go and catch them all. What, again, are the kind of potential, what is the potential of augmented reality? Do you think it's more accessible? Mark?
I've not really worked too much on augmented reality, so I might have to pass the book on to someone else on the panel. But certainly, even just the examples you were citing there, it just kind of shows the power that games have, and especially with inclusive design and making sure that games are accessible to as many people as possible, because it's not just about playing games, it's about making friends, socializing, having those kind of interactions that you maybe can't have in everyday life because of a specific impairment. So certainly it's important to address that, no matter if it's just, standard, I think flat gaming is what we're calling TV gaming now, or VR or AR or mixed reality. But yeah, I'll pass on to someone with more AR experience.
Henry, you haven't got AR experience.
I've got no AR experience.
But just your view, I mean, we all know about Pokemon Go, and I'm sure we've all played it, but the potential of that kind of mobile game experience or that augmented reality experience, I mean, obviously for visually impaired, that's quite a challenge.
Absolutely, but I think as well, augmented reality, and especially Pokemon Go, does something really special for kids that maybe don't want to go out of the house or don't want to engage in social interaction, and then it offers that motivation, which is, I think, is kind of another area that isn't really necessarily discussed that much, and it's about enabling people to feel better about themselves in order to go out and do things that they wouldn't normally do. And I think that's really exciting, but in terms of making AR experiences accessible, it sounds like a challenge similar to what making VR games accessible will be like, because the guidelines will be written, and that needs to be put in one place and used as a reference.
Henry, can you just explain to me, I'm interested in the sort of economic impact and how we do measure that when we do something that actually is far more inclusive. You obviously saw an economic impact, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely.
How did you measure that? Were you specifically looking out for that?
So that was never our intention. Our intention was to make the game as many people as possible to enjoy the game. What we noticed very quickly is that when we started putting out trailers, sort of the number one comments were like, I can't play this game, I've got colorblindness. And I would reply and I'd be like, it's okay, we've added a colorblind mode. But then after we released the game, and as we started seeing the reviews come in, that every single review mentioned the fact that the game was sort of widely accessible. And if you look at our Metacritic listing for all the reviews for Hue, it's like all our top reviews mention and praise the fact that we've supported players with disabilities. And I think, I mean, if you're using Metacritic as a gauge for sort of commercial viability, it was massive for us, really. I think it's a massive indicator that reviewers in particular, and obviously gamers that are leaving user reviews, massively appreciate like these accessibility features.
Yep.
Something else is just tracking feature usage. I mean, it can be difficult to tie an individual feature to accessibility, to disability. One example of a feature that you kind of can is screen readers that we've mentioned a few times, because it's a fairly safe bet that the majority of people who have a screen reader turned on are going to be blind players. And I've seen some nice data on that. One was a game called MudRammer. It was a MUD client. So I've seen most people are familiar with MUDs, but if not, it's like a kind of a text version of World of Warcraft. So it's relatively straightforward for them to make that blind accessible. Only took, I think it took him about a day, and slightly under 1% of the population is blind. So he was hoping maybe, you know, if people have heard about this, then maybe slightly under 1% of my players might be blind. And he tracked the feature usage, and there's actually more like 14%. And another similar example, a game called Solara. This is a quite visual iOS strategy game. So that took them a bit longer. It's a bit more complicated. Took them about 2 weeks of dev time. Again, they're thinking maybe you might get this kind of, you know, just under 1%, and they did. It was just under 1%, but when they dug into the data a bit further, they found out that just under 1% was playing for much, much longer than anyone else and spending much, much more in-app purchases than anyone else. So both those things, that the guy made MudRammer, he sold his game for $5 a time, made an instant profit on it. These people who basically discovered that they're whales, were their blind gamers. It comes down to the same thing, which is basically they're catering for an underserved audience.
Yeah. And definitely when there are inclusive features in games, then you know they're used by both people who need them to play the game and also people who just prefer to have that setting enabled. And while I can't specifically talk for games, I know in my previous life at an agency where I did a lot of work on websites and apps, and specifically on supermarkets, we attempted to make, one of our clients was Asda, and we were trying to make their website a lot more accessible because, as it happened, they had a large, well, the knowledge was that Sainsbury's was the go-to supermarket online shop for blind users because it wasn't, you know, particularly great in any way, but it was incredibly blind accessible, and so Asda wanted to try and make their websites more of a competitor to that. And in the work that they did, they specifically looked at trying to, you know, because the website for Sainsbury's was already so accessible, that's where everyone would do their shopping if they, you know, needed to use a screen reader. And it's almost the same for games in a way. If the feature is there, then you'll kind of end up with that kind of almost loyal audience who will kind of use that or buy that game, use that feature, and kind of engage with it in that respect.
I find it astonishing that not enough people kind of realise that or are sort of mindful of that and actually, you know, deliberately sort of looking out for, well, how can we... I just still find it absolutely astonishing, even in physical retail and so on.
I mean, it is a bit of a thing you got to get your head around, right? Like designing for the majority is not something that we try to do anymore. We try to pick very specific targets and expect things to get filled in. Like, you know, the example that we always like to use is that if we design something for someone with one hand, you know, it helps someone who's maybe has a broken arm, or it also helps someone who's holding a baby, right? Like if I'm holding a baby and I want to play a game, can I still do that? And I actually found it funny, like when they announced Mario Go, they're like, or eating a hamburger. I'm like, I still love that. I was like, that's my new example now. You know, so.
Yeah, nice example of that. There's actually two nice examples. Uncharted 4, they did some nice accessibility stuff in there. It's largely aimed at motor accessibility, including stuff that lets you play the game one-handed while you're eating the hamburger, I guess, would be an example of that. But yeah, so it's stuff with assists and simplified controls and automatic camera movement and stuff, so you can play it one-handed. And again, slightly under 1% of the population only have one hand. That feature was used by 30% of the players of Uncharted 4.
It's another classic example of when you have inclusive design, then you have sort of unintended consequences that capture, you know, the famous stories about voice recognition software that was designed by men that for a long time didn't recognize female voices, and airbags that were killing women because they were designed around an average-sized man. Anyway, so, you know.
Classic example of that, the keyboards,
Yeah.
which presumably is the primary means of communication apart from talking for most of the people in the room. That obviously came directly from the typewriter. The first ever working typewriter was built as assistive technology as a way for a blind woman to write a letter.
Right, wow. Amazing. Okay. We have about 8 minutes for some questions, if there are any questions from the floor. And we have microphones wandering around autonomously. Any questions for our fantastic panel? Yes, one here. We don't have any microphones. You might have just to shout.
We'll repeat.
What do you think the biggest accessibility issue that most game studios have, and what's your suggestion for solving it?
I'll go first then. So I think we've hit a point now where the advocacy is almost done, I want to say. But it's certainly at a point where it's just that kind of last bit of kind of everyone knows it's something that we should be doing now, and it's a case of getting dev teams kind of up to speed on what it is they can do and when they should be doing it. So it's all well and good kind of, you know, thinking about it at the end, but as we've already mentioned, like retrofitting stuff in, you know, at the end of the dev cycle or even post-launch can be a bit of a nightmare. So it's making sure that teams are aware kind of early enough and are knowledgeable enough about what they want to include that they can kind of fit that into the production cycle and make sure they can budget for that, both in terms of cost and time as well.
Not to be weird with that, but I mean, it depends what your game is, really.
Oh,
you know, like we had an Alexa talk this morning. You know, if I'm making a game for Alexa, I don't need to worry about color blindness. You know, so.
Yeah.
Just perhaps some gender bias.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think as well what the challenge is varies a bit depending on what kind of end of the industry you're at as well. So if you're an indie developer, it's more likely to be concerns about budget, like, you know, I'm self-funding, bootstrapping this on my own money, how am I going to find time to do this? And that's really more about an awareness thing of the same kind of thing.
Yeah, so demonstrating the economic benefit, actually, and having those sort of stories of where you have then captured far more of an audience than you might have.
But being aware of that stuff early on as well, you know? And I think that's a point we'll get to. You've got people now who are, a lot of people who are starting to implement stuff towards the end of development, who are then thinking, you know, that if only I thought about this from the start, I'd be able to do so much more. So you come to the next game, you can start doing, like classic thing being text size. That's one of the most common accessibility complaints. To go back and retrofit a larger text size is a nightmare. If you think about text size before you start designing anything, it's just a design decision. It's just free.
I've really struggled with that on my, with playing Zelda on my Switch, because I'm 44 and in denial.
There we go.
Henry.
I think as well, as an indie developer, basically what you were saying, that once you've been through that process as an indie developer and you've made the game kind of accessible towards the end of development, you know exactly what to look out for when starting the next game. It would be great, really, if there was a way for an indie developer not to have to go through that process, but to know from the offset. And there are online resources now, but convincing an indie developer that that's what they need to be thinking about when they're just sort of conceiving the idea is very difficult.
But indies do have an inbuilt advantage in that if you decide you want to do something, you can do it, which is a whole different
permission
ballgame
needed.
if you're in AAA. That's more the barrier at the other end of the industry, when you quite often have individual developers in a large studio who really, really want to do stuff, but then have like 3 or 4 levels of management above them. They got to persuade that it's got enough ROI to fit on the backlog against 1,000 other features.
Another question over here, and then this one.
That was sort of related to what you just said. I guess it's mostly a question to you at Sony and Xbox. Why do you think it is that accessibility features are not part of the certification process?
I can answer that. We don't tell developers.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't
No,
think that they are.
they're not. We don't tell developers how to make games. Simple as
Because
that.
a lot of the time it's that when you're a small team, you have to prioritize, and then you have to work on a massive list of very, very, very oddly specific, sometimes tier 2 requirements. But even the simplest accessibility features are entirely optional. So then you choose the thing that you're forced to do instead of the thing
Yeah, I mean that's super fair, and I mean when I say we don't tell developers how to make games, I actually worked on TCRs for a long time, so I kind of know that's not true. But at the same time, philosophically, I think that is our intention. We don't want to be prescriptive to people around what they create, you know. And I think in our studios, like that notion of the creator is still super powerful, and that does win out. To give you another kind of probably not safe industry answer, it's not really safe for us to give any advice that could be construed as legal advice.
Yeah, just on top of that, of course, because every game is different and has different requirements, it's a case of making sure in that regard that they're reaching the right kind of accessibility TRCs for that. But then also it's the kind of the design of the game as well, because a lot of time there's considerations when it comes to how the accessibility will interact with the overall design direction of the game, and if it's going to quote unquote kind of interfere with that, or if it's going to kind of complement that, or is there a way to kind of fit it in and kind of make it almost kind of toggleable or something like that?
Yeah, I think this is the same kind of point, I guess, that there isn't really a large amount that can be applied across all games, just because of the nature of what a game is. That there has to be, for it to meet the definition of a game, there has to be some kind of challenge involved, and that challenge is specific to that game and is going to be a barrier to some people. So say, for example, like in the web industry, a standard accessibility requirement is to avoid any reliance on precise timing. If you're developing a turn-based strategy game, that makes perfect sense. You don't want to have some button mashing sequence in the middle of that, which would exclude people who've bought that, not for that purpose at all. But if you're making a first-person shooter, it's a whole different ballgame. So it's more about figuring out what is the appropriate set of things to aim for that particular game. But there are a few things, things like subtitling and remapping that really could be mandated, that are mandated publisher level. So like BBC has accessibility requirements that have to be met. Some of the big publishers as well mandate things like subtitles and epilepsy testing and stuff. So there's definitely some things that could be.
Something we talked about as well at roundtables and various other discussions is having sort of voluntary requirements, which then have sort of consumer visibility. So if your game is accessible to people with color blindness, you'll get a little icon on the storefront that says the game is accessible to colorblind people. And then there's a real incentive there for the developer because they know that their game is going to appear as inaccessible. And I think that's a really good way of approaching it.
Yeah, some extra discoverability.
Yeah, that's a really nice idea. I mean, is there sort of directory that anyone can go to, that consumers can go to anyway, that's constantly updated with games that are accessible in different ways?
Not really. There's review sites, but they're kind of limited in how many games they can cover. It would be really, really nice to see storefronts tackling that. And Steam have started to some degree, so you can actually filter game searches listings on Steam by which games have subtitles or not. And Itch does it to a limited degree as well.
Okay, we'll take this question as the last question. And
I was just really quickly to ask, you've talked a lot about accommodating games for colourblind players and players who have trouble with vision. But other than subtitles, what are ways that you'd accommodate players who've got hearing loss or are hard of hearing or have some kind of difficulty with audio?
Well, actually, there's a really good example in the hardware space that Deaf Gamers TV, which is sort of a mini collective of gamers who are deaf, they introduced me to this this vest that you wear, and it's called the Sub Pack, and it's actually a DJ's vest. And what it does is it takes the sound and it makes it. It's kind of like a rumble pack for your body. So it's kind of fun. And when you start to wear something like that, it becomes really interesting when you start to think about spatial sound and how that could be applied to something as tactile as a vest. So they wear these things because when someone's sneaking up behind them and the game only sort of represents it as footsteps, they get little taps, right? So that they can see that. So that's one way to do it. I mean, I think especially when you're talking about the deaf and hard of hearing communities, there's a lot of work for us to do there to really enhance their experience. And there's a long road ahead there. But that's one way from a hardware perspective.
And visual keys as well, like classic being in a first-person shooter, where like in Gears of War, for example, when you're being shot, you get the little red cog in the middle that also indicates which direction you're being shot from, doing it completely visually. If that wasn't there and you don't have access to stereo sound, you could be shooting someone in front of you and no idea that someone's shooting from beside you and you'd be dead, you know?
Yeah.
Those kind of visual things.
Yeah, and just on top of that as well, it's just the subtitles book, like closed captioning as well. So you have in the subtitles like alarm sounds and any other cues that you might miss if you are hard of hearing or can't pick out those audio cues.
But even the subtitles itself, something really, really important is presentation
Yeah.
of subtitles. Because most games have subtitles, all games have terrible subtitles. There hasn't really been a game yet that's got decent subtitles in it.
Final
And
word to Henry.
Yeah, this isn't coming from me, it's from gamers in general.
Yeah.
So make sure your subtitles are high contrast, decent size, allow it to be configurable as well, like turn letterboxing on and off, that kind of stuff.
I think what's really interesting in the mobile space is that when designing a mobile game, the assumption is that people are playing without audio. So that's kind of designing the core game first and then building the audio on top of that afterwards. And I think that gives you a real insight into building games, the core experience without audio even enabled. And that's something how I approach PC games and console games anyway.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much to my wonderful panelists, and thank you for listening and asking your questions. And it looks like there's quite a way to go next, but it's very exciting. So thank you very much. Round of applause. Thank you.